It began with the Abraham Accords back in 2020 when the Middle East started seeing new diplomatic breakthroughs. Now, that process has rapidly expanded, lowering tensions and pausing long-time rivalries. Now, where is that more evident than in Saudi Arabia, which for decades had close security and political ties with the US? But the kingdom is now making peace with its former adversaries while looking for new partnerships further abroad. Saudi Arabia resumed trade relations with Iran less than 2 months after both countries fully restored ties. Riyadh also reportedly hosted Hamas's political chief after having shunned the Palestinian group for years. Meanwhile, the kingdom is also looking to end its years of hostility towards Syria after its foreign minister's recent trip to Damascus. It was the first such visit since the start of Syria's civil war in 2011, which led to the country's suspension from the Arab League. So is Saudi Arabia pursuing a new foreign policy that keeps a healthy distance from Washington? And now to further discuss Saudi Arabia's rapprochement with its neighbors, joining me now from London is Hafet Al-Ghouel. He is a senior fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And from Ankara, Betül Doğan Akkaş. She is a researcher on Gulf Arab states. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Betül, could you walk us through the latest diplomatic flurry ongoing in the Middle East? Is the region realigning?
We can definitely define this as a realliance, considering the talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, their current deal in Beijing. But we don't know what kind of realliances is going to come out of these talks. Are we going to have more powers, state and non-state actors involved with Saudi policymaking, which is going to be dominated by Saudi Arabia's choice and options in the region? Or are we going to have a middle ground between Iran and Saudi Arabia involved by other actors, which will be more sort of negotiations and further de-escalations, and both parties are going to kind of sacrifice some of their choices in the region? Yeah.
So, Hafet, do you have any doubts about this new realignment in the region, as Betül does?
No, I don't think so. I think the region needs to realign. I think it's not really a choice. I think the geopolitics that is surrounding the region, the big power competition between the United States, China, and also Russia, I think all the internal factors, the destabilization that's been taking place over the many years, I think the emergence of some centers of serious power in the region, including Turkey and Iran, I think all of these factors, the economic realities, I think all of these factors will force the region to rethink its relationships. I think also the fact that the United States has recalibrated its own interest in the region and has pulled back to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, is also forcing that region to recognize that it's a whole new world now.
So before we discuss it further, especially the Saudi Arabia's efforts to mend its ties with its neighbors, I just want to go over some of the shifts that the kingdom has undertaken recently. So the kingdom has mended ties with a number of former adversaries, most notably, as you said, Iran and Syria and other countries like Turkey and Qatar. Riyadh is also trying to push a peace deal in Yemen. Following the US's gradual withdrawal from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia has stepped up its role, including leading the push for OPEC Plus to cut oil production. And Riyadh's relations with the US's greatest adversary, China, have grown in recent years. Saudi Arabia also recently joined the Chinese-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a dialogue partner. So my question is, Betül, are these all concrete signs that Saudi Arabia, after decades of walking in step with the United States, is forging its own path?
I think the priority of Saudi foreign policy at the moment, as the previous speaker mentioned, is actually kind of bring more interest groups together, because for further economic development in the Middle East, all powers understood they need to de-escalate somehow their tension since the Arab Spring started. So this is why I believe Saudi Arabia is kind of trying a midway between its interests and choices amid all these conflicts. This is why we have a kind of elusive situation in foreign policy between US, China, and Russia in Saudi foreign policy making. But I don't see this as a complete reorientation of Saudi foreign policy making. Since the emergence of the nation state, there has been reorientations in Saudi foreign policy, but this is somehow actually kind of balanced moves in the last decade. So it is more focused on practical alliances and, of course, ideological issues and sectarian narratives as well involved, but more practical alliances and more economic goals we are seeing now at the moment.
Hafed, what do you think? Is the kingdom really distancing itself from Washington?
Well, to some extent, but I agree entirely. I think this Saudi Arabia, among other countries, are now refocusing their foreign policies in a way that is becoming more of a transactional foreign policy and separating various issues from each other. In the old days, even Americans and Saudis thought of themselves as, friends, allies across the board. No matter what, the Saudis will always align themselves with whatever Washington wants. I think Saudis now, with the new leadership, is trying to sort of unpack that relationship and saying, in a sense, okay, we would like to maintain our good relationships with you, but we're not going to do so despite our own interest with other countries like China, like Russia, like Turkey, like Iran. They're starting to realize that you cannot become a proxy for the United States across the board, that they need to watch out for their own interest. I mean, at the end of the day, I think everybody in the region in general recognizes something that is very basic of geography and politics.
Yes.
Turkey, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Egypt, these are facts on the ground, in a sense, that none of them is going to go anywhere.
Yes.
You have to deal with neighbors whether you like them or not. And the United States, however, it's 10,000 miles away. And therefore, the United States can afford very easily to pull out and not be engaged. Especially now, the U.S. itself is rethinking its entire foreign policy approach to the Gulf.
Yes.
In the Arab world, there were two major unchanging anchors for U.S. foreign policy for the last 60, 70 years. One was the oil dimension, and two was the Israeli security. Both of these are no longer really as urgent as they were before.
So, bit to Saudi Crown Prince, MBS has recently hosted Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, and also with reports that a delegation from Hamas was in the kingdom. Is some sort of peace deal in the making, and what are the prospects of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Hamas?
So there has been tension, as we all know, between Hamas and Saudi Arabia since 2015, even before the relationship wasn't on a very settled ground. But Hamas has been a double threat to Saudi Arabia, and not only in Palestinian cause, but also in general in terms of its regional policies, especially after the tensions between Muslim Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia, because Hamas represents Muslim Brotherhood and represents Iran. So these are two power axes that Saudi Arabia doesn't feel secure when it comes to its own regime legitimacy and regional strategies. So this is why once we have deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Hamas is one step further to Saudi Arabia, because now one of his allies is also part of Saudi power projection in the region. So this is why I can't say it's a deal yet, or we don't know if a deal is emerging, but definitely the conditions now between two powers actually kind of evolving to a de-escalation. And this is practical for both parties. Saudi Arabia needs some sort of solution in Palestine as one of the is involved, and Hamas needs practical support from the Arab countries after having all these countries normalize with Israel. So why not Saudi Arabia backing them?
So if we move to the Syria angle, because I'm running out of time and I need short answers from both of you. So Hafez, Syrian Foreign Minister Faisal Mekdad visited Cairo 2 weeks ago, and then another visits followed. So how important was it, as it represented a major normalization between a key Saudi ally and a key Iranian ally?
It's very important. I mean, the overall umbrella under which everybody is now operating, and it's led by Saudi Arabia, is de-escalating all the problems. They figured out that there is no winner in fighting others or trying to eliminate or remove others from existence. They're not going to be able to remove the Muslim Brotherhood or any of the Islamic political dimension. I'm not talking about the terrorist extremists. I'm talking about political parties. They're not going to be able to get rid of them even after 20 years, 10 years of investing and trying to do so. They're not going to remove the regime of Bashar al-Assad. They're not going to remove the regime in Iran. They're not going to be able to threaten somebody of the heavy weight of Turkey. That now, so they came to the realization is the only alternative for us is to de-escalate, to try to reduce any kind of tension and deal with the various parts in a more pragmatic, transactional way. That is, I'm going to give you this, you give me something back. But they're not going to try to get each other out of existence. It's not going to happen. And finally, everybody, I think, came to that realization, no matter what the disagreements are.
So, Betül, is the Assad regime's full rehabilitation imminent now?
Yeah, I think so. Not for the all Arab states, because we have seen some kind of resistance from Qatar, but especially for Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, also with some other countries, including Turkey. There are more talks between the political elites. We have seen visits. Yeah. I mean, most of the Arab states are spending a lot politically and economically to the war in Syria. And as we all understood, escalation doesn't help to anyone. But in this case, there were parties clashing each other since maybe last 10 years. So with the current deal with Iran, I think we might see even more when it comes to legitimacy of Syrian regime in the Middle East.
And we'll see if that leads to the restoration of ties between the regime and Turkey. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.